"I can't marry you," Ethan said, standing at the altar in front of 200 guests, my father's vineyard stretching out behind him in the late afternoon light. "I'm in love with Renee." My own sister walked up the aisle toward him a moment later, still in her bridesmaid dress, and took his hand in front of everyone I had ever loved. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood there in my wedding dress and felt something click into place that had nothing to do with heartbreak at all. He thought he was choosing between two sisters. What he didn't understand was that he'd just chosen the one who came with absolutely nothing. But to understand what happened over the following 11 days, you need to know something about my family that neither Ethan nor my sister ever fully understood, even after years of both of them trying to. My name is Maya Bennett. My family has owned Bennett Hollow Vineyards for 3 generations, built originally by my grandfather in the years after he emigrated with almost nothing, and expanded steadily by my father into one of the more respected mid-sized wine producers in the region. I grew up genuinely working the harvests, learning the business from the ground floor, spending my 20s in viticulture school, and then apprenticing under our head winemaker before eventually taking over most of the vineyard's actual operations by my late 20s. My younger sister, Renee, 3 years behind me, took a different path entirely. She studied marketing, moved to the city after college, and came home for holidays and the occasional harvest weekend, always warm, always charming, always somehow managing to make our parents laugh in a way I sometimes envied. Since my own relationship with them had settled over the years into something more like respected business partnership than easy affection. I met Ethan Cole 4 years ago at an industry wine event, where he worked in distribution for a company that handled several regional vineyards logistics. He was polished, attentive, endlessly curious about the business side of winemaking in a way that felt, at the time, like genuine shared interest rather than anything more calculated. I want to be honest that our relationship moved quickly, faster than I'd normally have allowed myself looking back. Within 8 months, we were living together. Within 2 years, engaged. Ethan integrated himself into vineyard operations almost immediately, offering to help with distribution contracts, sitting in on family business meetings, gradually becoming, in my parents' eyes and my own, someone who understood our family's legacy almost as deeply as I did. I noticed things, occasionally, that troubled me in small ways I didn't fully examine at the time. Ethan asked, more than once, oddly specific questions about how the vineyard's ownership structure worked, about succession planning, about what would happen to controlling interest if something happened to my father. I told myself this was simply diligence, the kind of practical curiosity a future son-in-law might reasonably have about a business he'd soon be connected to. I want to be honest about something else, too. Renee's visits home became noticeably more frequent starting about 18 months before the wedding, always coinciding, I understand now, with weekends Ethan was also home rather than traveling for work. I noticed this pattern. I told myself repeatedly that my sister simply missed home more as she got older, and that Ethan's presence was incidental rather than the actual reason. 6 months before the wedding, my grandmother, Eleanor Bennett, who still lived in the original farmhouse on the property and remained sharper and more observant than any of us gave her full credit for, asked to speak with me privately one afternoon. She told me carefully that she'd noticed something in Ethan's manner around the family business that concerned her, something she described only as a man more interested in the value of a thing than the thing itself. I want to be honest that I was defensive in that conversation. I told her Ethan simply cared about my family's legacy because he cared about me. My grandmother didn't argue further. She simply said, in a tone I didn't fully understand until much later, "Just make sure what's yours stays clearly, provably yours, regardless of what happens with him." I didn't think much more about that conversation until the day of my wedding. I want to walk through what actually happened at the altar, because the shock of it matters for understanding what came afterward. Ethan's confession wasn't hesitant or apologetic in the way you might expect from someone confessing an affair. It was almost rehearsed, delivered with a strange, unsettling confidence, as though he'd convinced himself this dramatic public reveal was somehow the honest, Brave choice rather than simply the cruelest possible way to end things. Renee's walk up the aisle toward him, still in her bridesmaid dress, suggested this wasn't a spontaneous confession at all, but something they'd planned together, timed deliberately for maximum, humiliating spectacle in front of every person either of our families had ever known. My parents sat frozen in the front row. I remember my mother's hand covering her mouth. I remember my father standing up halfway before seeming to freeze entirely, unable to decide what to actually do in a moment nothing in his life had prepared him for. I simply stood there, in my dress, and felt something surprisingly close to clarity arrive underneath the devastation. I want to be honest about the days immediately following the wedding, because they weren't dignified or composed in the way I might present them if I were embellishing this story for effect. I cried. I didn't leave my childhood bedroom in the farmhouse for nearly 3 days. I felt, genuinely, like the version of my life I'd spent 4 years building had been revealed as something hollow, watched by 200 people, and taken from me by the 2 people I trusted most. It was my grandmother who finally came to sit with me on the 3rd day, bringing with her an old leather folder I recognized vaguely from childhood, one she used to keep locked in her writing desk. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me something that reframed everything I thought I understood about my own life, in the space of about 10 minutes. Nearly 6 years earlier, before Ethan and I had even met, my grandmother told me she had grown quietly concerned about a pattern she'd witnessed across her own long life: men marrying into agricultural family businesses specifically for eventual ownership access. A pattern she'd seen play out badly for 2 women in her own extended social circle decades earlier. Rather than simply worrying privately, she had gone, on her own, to our family's estate attorney and restructured a portion of her own separate personal holdings, entirely independent of my father's business, into an irrevocable trust naming me specifically, by name, as sole beneficiary, vesting fully and immediately with no marriage contingency, no spousal involvement clause, and critically, no mechanism by which any future spouse could ever gain legal claim to it through marriage or divorce proceedings. This trust, she explained, held a controlling 22% ownership stake in Bennett Hollow Vineyards itself, shares my grandmother had quietly accumulated and set aside over decades specifically to ensure that whoever eventually ran the business would hold real, protected ownership independent of any marriage, an outcome she'd arranged years before Ethan ever entered our lives, based purely on her own long-held caution rather than any specific suspicion of him. I hadn't known this trust existed at all. My grandmother told me she'd simply been waiting for the right moment to explain it to me, a moment she'd assumed, reasonably, would arrive naturally sometime in my 30s rather than 3 days after being abandoned at my own wedding. I want to be honest that learning this didn't undo the pain of what Ethan and Renee had done. But it did something important. It clarified with total certainty exactly what Ethan had actually been chasing for the better part of 4 years, and exactly how thoroughly his calculation had failed. What my grandmother explained next was the piece that made everything about the wedding day finally make sense. My father, it turned out, had recently begun discussing eventual succession planning more openly within the family, mentioning at a dinner several months earlier, in front of both Ethan and Renee, that controlling interest in the vineyard would likely pass to whichever daughter remained most involved in actually running the business, language he'd intended simply as acknowledgement of my years of hands-on work, but which Ethan had apparently interpreted incorrectly, as an open question about which sister he needed to be married to in order to eventually gain access to family wealth. Ethan, it seems, had misunderstood entirely. He didn't know about my grandmother's separate, already vested trust. He believed, based on my father's casual dinner comment, that ownership access ran through whichever daughter he married, rather than understanding it had already been permanently, irrevocably settled years earlier, tied specifically and unchangeably to me by name, regardless of my marital status at all. I want to walk through what happened over the following 11 days, because this is where reality began moving considerably faster than Ethan or Renee anticipated. Renee, staying with Ethan at his apartment in the days following the wedding, apparently grew anxious enough about the family's silence toward her that she reached out to our mother directly, hoping, I think, for some path back toward reconciliation, or at minimum information about how the family intended to handle the business fallout from what she and Ethan had done. In that conversation, according to my mother, Renee let slip something she likely didn't intend to reveal so plainly, that she and Ethan had discussed, more than once over recent months, exactly how Vineyard ownership would eventually work between us, and that Ethan had seemed confident, based on conversations with my father, that it wouldn't matter in the end which sister he ended up with. My mother relayed this to my father immediately. My father, already deeply unsettled by the wedding day itself, initiated a formal financial review of Vineyard operations that same week, something my grandmother had actually already quietly encouraged him to consider even before the wedding, based on her own long-standing unease about Ethan's role in the business. That review uncovered something none of us had suspected until that exact week. Ethan, through his distribution company access, had been quietly directing a small but steady percentage of Vineyard shipment invoices through an intermediary account for just over 2 years, skimming margin differentials that individually looked like reasonable business costs, but that aggregated across 2 years of shipments amounted to just over $160,000 diverted away from the Vineyard's actual revenue. I want to be honest that discovering this didn't feel like vindication exactly. It felt mostly like watching the last remaining piece of my 4-year relationship with Ethan reveal itself as something I had never actually known at all. The version of him who asked thoughtful questions about succession planning, who integrated himself so naturally into family meetings, had apparently, the entire time, been building a quiet financial exit plan alongside whatever he believed his marriage into the family would eventually provide. The Vineyard's attorneys moved quickly once the diversion was documented. Ethan's distribution contract was terminated immediately, and a civil suit for recovery of the diverted funds was filed within the same month, supported by a financial audit trail Harold Pruitt, our family's longtime business attorney, described as unusually easy to trace, for someone who apparently believed he had years left to keep doing this quietly. Ethan attempted, through his own attorney, to negotiate a reduced settlement, but with the evidence as clearly documented as it was, and with Renee, still reeling from the reality that marrying Ethan had gained her precisely nothing regarding the family wealth she may have assumed came with him, providing corroborating details about conversations she'd had with him regarding Vineyard finances. The case settled within 4 months for the full diverted amount plus legal costs. I want to be honest about where things stand with Renee now, because I don't think this story is served by pretending our relationship simply resolved itself neatly. We are not close. We have spoken exactly twice since the wedding, both times briefly, both times centered entirely on practical matters related to the settlement, rather than any real reconciliation. I understand, in a distant, complicated way, that she likely believed she was choosing love rather than money when she walked up that aisle. I also understand that whatever she believed in that moment, she chose it while wearing my bridesmaid dress, at my wedding, in front of everyone either of us had ever known. I don't know if we'll ever fully repair what happened between us. I've made peace mostly with the possibility that we won't. The Vineyard itself is thriving. My father formally transferred day-to-day operational leadership to me 8 months after the wedding. A transition my grandmother's trust made entirely uncomplicated, since I already held clear, independent ownership stake regardless of any family sentiment or lingering awkwardness the wedding fallout might otherwise have created. I think about my grandmother's warning often, the one she gave me 6 months before the wedding, about a man more interested in the value of a thing than the thing itself. I understand now that she saw, years before I could bring myself to see it, exactly what Ethan actually valued about our family. I'm grateful, in a way I don't think I can fully express, that she chose to act on that instinct quietly, years in advance, rather than simply hoping she was wrong. Reality did hit fast in the end, just not in the direction either Ethan or my sister ever expected. He thought he was gaining access to a family fortune by choosing differently at the altar. Instead, he lost the actual relationship that held any real, protected claim to it, exposed a financial scheme that had been quietly running for 2 years, and left my sister holding nothing but the consequences of a choice she made based on a calculation that had never actually been true. If you've made it this far with me, do you think Renee knew about the embezzlement? Or do you think Ethan kept that part hidden even from her? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one matter to you, make sure you're subscribed to Justice Unfolds, because every story here has a reckoning,